Hello, everyone. I wanted to have more conversations, so today I have CJ. It's this side. CJ. He also goes by Morlon online, and I first saw him through. He had an amazing conversation with Paul Vanderklay, and uh, I wanted to reach out to him and kind of connect because I think there's a lot of connections to be made in this space with video games and kind of these ideas around philosophy and religion. And so it was a great opportunity to see him and to be able to connect and to have this conversation. So I'm really thankful to have him here and to kind of both pick his brain and kind of share maybe where we see all this kind of connecting together. So thank you for joining.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I think one thing that you've talked a bit about, and we had kind of chatted a little bit beforehand, was about these connections to kind of TLC-ish adjacent stuff. Jonathan Peugeot and Paul Vanderklay and Jordan Peterson. Where do you see the connection between the video game kind of space and that? And then maybe I'll kind of give you where I'm thinking these all connect to.
Yeah. Well, so video games, obviously there's a huge spectrum, right? You've got some video games that the storylines or whatever is being told is kind of just filler, or it's not that inspired. I would say most of them are like that. Like the story is kind of there because it has to be. But every once in a while, you get a game where the story is kind of front and center, and it's a major focus, especially in role-playing games. And what I think is interesting about video game storytelling in a lot of these cases is that the story is cobbled together by an entire team of people. And so you'll have like a writer who thinks something is cool, but then you'll also have like a producer who thinks something is cool, or like someone who's not even, supposed to be involved with the writing, who's like, hey, I really think it'd be interesting if this character said this or did this. And like, you read interviews about like the Final Fantasy series comes to mind here, where you read interviews about how these stories were actually created. And it's very distributed in that sense. It's not one person who has all the ideas and then people are kind of forming to them. It's like this person pitches in and this person pitches in, and then that comes together and the story kind of emerges out of that. And so I think that it's one of the things that separates it from a novel or something like that. And it's one of those things that gives it kind of that like deeper mythological reach, I would say, because I think a lot of the older stories and Jonathan Peugeot talks a lot about like fairy tales, for example. I would imagine that most fairy tales are the same way. It's not like a guy wrote a fairy tale and then like that version was passed on. Like people kind of change it over time and add things, and so some parts of it get kind of forgotten and left aside. And so it's more of this group effort over time that emerges into something that's really memorable and really sticks and really grabs you. And I see that happening in certain video games, especially like with the Final Fantasy series. And I would love someday to try to like convince Jonathan Peugeot to play through one of these games and analyze it, because I'll be watching his take on some fairy tale, or even his take on like Old Testament scripture, and going through the symbolism of it, and I can see like a shocking amount of parallels to like the symbols he's drawing out, or to the this is the way people remember things, or this is the way people think about things. And the way he's describing it, I'm like, man, like we're still doing that today in a lot of these video games. These things are kind of at the edge of consciousness, and they're being born out of this group cognition. And it is in a lot of ways like how these older myths or fairy tales or whatever have emerged. So I see a lot of when it comes to, I guess, the connection to Peugeot in particular, I see a lot of that. And I guess that kind of relates to Peterson too, because that's his whole thing is with, I got into Peterson at first when he was talking about, the Genesis stories, and talking about like how these ideas kind of slowly emerge and they come from a dreamlike state where you're not fully conscious of what you're saying, but there's some deeper truth kind of underneath the propositional that sort of takes form over time. And I think you can see that in all art. I think that's kind of like what art is, but video games are in a particularly unique position right now, I think, to call that out of like more than one person simultaneously.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've never thought about the group the group storytelling, the communal storytelling that comes with making a video game. Because my mind, when I think about the connection, is it's the practice and the practice that comes into the art, I guess is the way I would put it. This idea of participatory art. There's not
Yeah.
too many forms of that, and almost all the ones we have are games of some sort, whether it's a like Dungeons and Dragons, or if it's an RPG, or um, very few. I'm trying to think of outside. Maybe sports could be a form of like participatory art, but beyond that, there doesn't seem to be too much of a role for that in our society. And
Yeah.
to have video games kind of start to fill that role, and to have these also, sorry, I'm also rambling, these connections between the gameplay itself and the story being told. When games can capture that, it's super impressive to me, at least. My mind goes to like, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, the participatory thing, my mind goes in two directions with that, because it's, in one sense, there's like the D&D sense of participation where, I've run a D&D campaign for the last like 7 or 8 years or something. And I write all these, detailed backgrounds and settings and characters and stuff. And then often my players will just take what I've written and just go hard left and like completely ignore it, or they'll kill the guy that's supposed to help them, or like, they'll just do something crazy. But often I will put a problem in front of them, and I'll have like one or two things. Okay, they'll be able to solve this by doing A or B, and they'll come up with this completely crazy solution that I never would have imagined, and then it makes my story better. It makes more sense even in the context of what I've written. I'm like, oh wow, like yeah, that is better. Like the option that they came up with here does create a more interesting story than kind of the vision that I was paving out as an individual. But then the other thing, when you say participatory, with video games in particular, what comes to mind is, like the Dark Souls games, because I feel like in those games, the story is not, a lot of the story is not told to you. Like in a Final Fantasy game, it's dialogue, it's cutscenes. You're like participating in this movie, right? And you like have battles and whatever, but most of the story is kind of like expository. In Dark Souls, there's a little bit of that. You get some dialogue here and there, but most of the story is told in the setting. It's told in the fights themselves, and you playing through the game. Like the original Dark Souls, I think is the masterpiece at this. Like even things like the design elements of the game, like the difficulty of the game, is part of the story. You are supposed to die in this game. You're supposed to lose to the bosses over and over again and get discouraged and overcome that discouragement in order to move forward. And that is part of the story that's being told to you, but it's also something that like you literally have to do if you want to progress in the game. So yeah, those are like two completely different arcing branches, but both those things kind of popped into my mind when you brought that up.
Definitely. One that came into my mind was there's, man, what's the name of that DLC? There's a DLC in Fallout New Vegas where it's the Great Divide. It's like the last DLC of the game, and throughout the DLC, there's like a million turning back points that they're just basically telling you like, okay, that's it. Like just go back. You don't need to keep going through this, and you have a million chances to just walk away from the situation, but you just keep going because you're the player. Like, what else are you going to do?
Yeah.
You're going to just quit the game.
Right.
And using that as a form, at the very end of the DLC, there's a conversation with a character, and that character is pointing out how you never turned back and how your actions as the player seem like completely crazy within the context of the universe, and that says something about the character themselves, that they're willing to keep going even though it doesn't seem like there's anything at the end of this road. And just these really interesting I don't know, finding a way to use the narrative that's created by the player playing the game as part of this structure is really fascinating.
So are you incentivized in that DLC to dip out? Like, is there some kind of reason why you would not pursue past those turning back points?
Not really as a player, right? Because
Yeah,
you're playing a game. So if you die, you just reload and you keep playing. But for the
right.
character, there's like, gosh, like you're basically there's you're just kind of pushing forward for no reason, and you encounter like the hardest enemies in the game. They're all like
Yeah.
10 levels above anything else you've ever encountered. Um,
So it's just the difficulty is kind of the incentive to opt out of it all. Yeah,
yeah, and
that's
narrative, like
interesting.
curiosity.
Yeah,
And for an average person, if they said, no, I was just curious, I wanted to also challenge myself to go down this path. It's like, that's ridiculous. Why would you do that? There's nothing for
yeah.
you over here.
It's cool too because things like that feel like there's still so much more potential that hasn't been reached. Like I could
Hmm.
imagine a similar scenario to that where, um, the designer really does make it seem like a better option to not turn back, like in some way that's integrated into the actual gameplay. Like I don't know, maybe your character's like de-leveling the further you go or something. Like I can imagine some like gameplay incentive where it's like really, really like, why are you bothering with this? But some players would still choose to persevere and then, reach some outcome at the end.
I've had this idea in my head of a game where the first half involves, like an open world. I'm kind of crazy ideas, but like a Skyrim open world where you kind of can do anything, and comes a point where, um, if you want to continue on with the story, you have to give up stuff. So all the stuff
Mm,
that you acquired up to that point, you have to give it away, and you think you only have to give a little bit away, but then as you give it more away, you realize, oh, it's going to be everything.
yeah.
And then you can turn back and you can keep playing the game and you can have your fun. But like if you want to actually continue or like access the other half of the game, you have to give everything up. Um, and it's hard to find a way to say like I still want it to feel like it matters, right? I still want to make sure that it feels like the first half really has a purpose.
Yeah.
But I like the idea of having to slowly give stuff up, and in giving stuff up, that's where the resolution can begin to happen. Um, but then also incentivize the player to like, hey, if you don't want to do this, there is a game that you can play, and you can keep playing until you get bored, and you'll be overpowered. Um, but then you can give it up, and then you can play the game. You can keep playing the game.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. And there's a lot of games now that will kind of, have some sort of prestige mode or new game plus or something
Mhm.
that's kind of an inkling of that. But obviously you get to keep your progress. They just ramp up the difficulty. It'd
Mhm.
be
And
it'd be
it's
fun to
the same
see
thing
how.
over and over too.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. And it seems like it usually speeds up, right? For prestige, it usually doesn't take as long every time. Like the difference
Yeah,
between
unless the difficulty's like, crazy high. But I mean, I remember I played New Game Plus on Dark Souls over and over again, right? And
Mhm.
the New Game Plus runs were only a few hours long, whereas, my first playthrough of Dark Souls is probably, I don't know, 30 or 40 hours or something. So, um, and you kind of know where everything is. And so,
Yeah,
yeah.
you're making me want to jump into Dark Souls 3 again, and there's been a lot of time spent in that one.
Man, if you ever playing around with the randomizers, that like completely revived Dark Souls 1 for me, because I mean, like I said, I've played it start to finish so many times. But I downloaded one of the randomizers a couple years
Mhm.
ago and loaded into the first zone, and there was like a mid-game boss that was like right there in the first zone, like already challenging me, and I had to like fight him with the starter weapon, and I'm like, oh yeah, the Dark Souls is back. Like it gave me that initial like difficult, that spike that I had from the beginning of the game, where because like I no longer know where everything is, I no longer know where all the items are, all the enemies are, like um so because even if you play through Dark Souls, I've done like runs where I don't level up or something like that, but I still know where everything is. I know what to expect. And so it's just like the execution has to ramp up. But yeah, with the randomizer, it's like, oh no, this feels like how it did the first time I played. I don't know what's going to happen next. So that if you ever want to try that, I highly recommend it.
Fair, yeah. I tried doing a soul level 1 for Dark Souls 3, and I got to a certain point, and my ability to parry kind of got tested too much, and I realized, okay, I'm starting to hit a little bit of a wall here, but I felt like I got relatively far. I think I got like 33%, 40% of the way through.
Yeah.
Um, but when you die from one hit from everything, it kind of reaches a point where it's like, oh, that's
Yeah,
it's hard to push forward.
you really gotta tighten it up.
But have you seen Paul made a video a while back, and it's one I reference all the time, but he made a video about Elden Ring.
No, I haven't seen
really
that.
bizarre.
That's
Yeah.
surprising.
He had gotten recommended it's like Psychology of Games. I can't remember what YouTube channel it is. I've seen it around a few times, but I think he got it randomly in the algorithm, and so he watched it, and it was a really interesting conversation about agency and how Dark Souls deals with agency, and this kind of false difficulty of Dark Souls, where it's a difficult game, but it's really not like crazy difficult if you actually know what you're doing. Once you start getting into it, you're like, oh, I know how this all fits together. And also the part where the game lets you come back to life, right? When you die, you don't die forever. And so this idea that Dark Souls and other difficult games pose themselves as a huge challenge, but they're challenges meant to be overcome. Yeah. And that's how they function is they have that positive effect psychologically because of that, because they pose themselves up as a challenge, but they give you all the tools to be able to keep trying and get to that point. And one video that came to my mind was also the I don't know if you're familiar, but Nikki Jakey made a video called How Dark Souls Saved My Life. And it's like a really low-key video where he's laying in bed with like a night light on, and he's on his side as the camera is facing him, and he's just kind of telling the story of his childhood. But the effect on his life of having Dark Souls in that moment of his life where he felt like he had no control, and being able to beat this video game that was talked about as being the hardest video game in the world, and everybody talks all about it, and to be able to feel like, oh, I can do something. I actually have some agency. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, if you if you go on YouTube and Google something about Dark Souls depression or Dark Souls suicide or Dark Souls like anything in that category, you'll get an enormous amount of results. It's not this hasn't just happened to one or two people, and there's not a lot of games that you can do that. You probably, if you Googled like Super Mario Galaxy saved my life, probably going to get less hits. It's not like to rag on that game or anything, but there's something about the original Dark Souls that does produce like a deep, meaningful experience for a lot of people. And I think the difficulty is a core piece of that. I don't think it's the entire equation, because there's lots of difficult games that don't produce that either. In fact, there's some games that are way harder than Dark Souls, because like you said, in Dark Souls, if you just explore a little bit, or if you're one of those people who looks up guides, yikes, but if you want you can look stuff up that'll make it way easier. But even if you don't, if you explore a little bit, or even if you just spend some time leveling up in the easy, if you just master killing like the first little zombie over and over again, like you can level up to the point where the entire first area will be trivial if you just level up for like an hour. It doesn't take that long to really get much stronger in that game. And then once you figure out how to upgrade your weapons and stuff, you can become super strong. I did a deathless playthrough of Dark Souls, and I was doing this on stream, and so I would get all these comments where people would come in and be like, like, whoa, like you must be so good at this, like you're gonna play the whole game without dying. And it's like, I have a lot of practice, so there's some skill to it, but honestly, like it's like 20% skill and 80% preparation. Most of this is just like getting my character to a certain level, using the right gear, like knowing what to, like it's not I'm overcoming the difficulty not because I'm just like such a badass Dark Souls player. It's because I just know where to go in the game to make things easier. And Elden Ring, I think is the easiest game they've ever made for this reason, because, you know, in some ways it has some of the hardest bosses that they've ever come up with. And there's more mechanics, and the bosses are like smarter. They're better at like reading your inputs and things like that. So in an absolute sense, the level of difficulty is higher. But Elden Ring also gives you way more tools than any of the other games. There's way more spells. You know, there's way
Yeah.
more different paths that you can. There's way more levels. You know, you can in a Dark Souls you level up to like 70 or 80 by the end of the game. In Elden Ring you level up to like 250 by the end of the game. So there's way more stats you can play around with. And but yeah, all that to say, the difficulty is there. But if you look around, or if you if you ask your friends for help, or the equivalent of that is kind of like going on the guide and looking it up. There are ways you can make the game almost like trivially easy, to the point where like a boss has to hit you like 10 times in a row without you healing for you to die, because you have so much health and so much armor. And so, yeah, it's interesting because you can almost, and I think people do this intuitively, you kind of scale the difficulty to the, that phrase like zone of proximal development comes to mind, where it's like, if you want to get better at something, it has to be just the right amount of difficulty. It can't be too hard. It can't be too easy. And I feel like people intuitively find that in games like Dark Souls, because if you're just losing over and over again, you are going to go level up. You are going to go like try to figure out how to upgrade your weapon, or you are going to go look up a strategy online. And then, if things are too easy, then you might like get bored and take some armor off, or you might just like plow through the next couple levels super quickly. And then all of a sudden you're fighting stuff that's much more difficult. And now you have to like think again. And so I think, one of the many, many things that game is a masterclass of is sort of intuitively, without the player even necessarily realizing that they're doing it, allowing people to find that difficulty that is most, meaningful to them. And it's crazy how that is curative when it comes to things like depression, because like
flow state too, right? That's the same kind of thing about having something that's just hard enough that it pushes you, but not too easy to kind of be boring.
Yeah. And I will have times when I'm streaming these games where, there was one boss in particular on Elden Ring, Moog. I don't know if have you played all the way through and all the, okay. So,
not quite all the way through, but I know enough. Yeah.
He's towards the end of the game. And, I was doing a subathon at this point, and so when people subscribed or donated, it would extend the timer so that I had to stream longer. And so I had been awake for like 30 hours at this point, and I was not on top of my Elden Ring gameplay at all. And now I had to go against this boss that has, not only is he pretty difficult out the gate, but then he's got some surprises once you think you've got him figured out. And so probably for like 4 hours straight at like 3 a.m. on 30 hours of sleep, I'm just throwing myself against this boss trying to figure it out. And I'm like so frustrated because the boss will start an attack and I'm like, okay, I know what to do here. I need to dodge left, but I'm so tired that I have this like 300 ms brain lag. And so I can't get myself to do the actions in the game that I need to do in order to beat this boss. So like that adds another layer of difficulty to it. And people in my chat will be like, after like an hour or two of just dying over and over again, people would say things like, hey, why don't you just like take a break and go do something else? Or like, why don't you go level up? Or why don't you? And I'm like, no, this is the build we're using. I'm not changing weapons. I'm not putting any spells on. I'm not equipping a shield. I'm not leveling up. This is the challenge that's in front of me right now. And this is the challenge that I'm going to beat. And they're right. Like if the boss seemed insurmountable, if I was going in there and getting one shot, I probably would go level up. I probably would go, do something else, or I probably would find a different build. But it's like, no, I'm going to use my big slow two-hander with this amount of health, with this amount of damage, and I'm not going to use any range attacks. And this is the challenge that's and like by the time I actually kill the boss, man, I don't care how depressed you are. That feels good. Like, it's like not only did I accomplish something, but I persevered. I didn't give up. So I did something difficult, but I did something difficult in the context of like people telling me, take a break and ignoring them and just pushing through anyways. There's something about that where it's like, yeah, of course it comes with a sense of, accomplishment and a sense of like, okay, yeah, um, if I just work at this and practice and challenge myself the right amount, then something kind of magical happens. And I think that's one of the things that makes those games so addicting.
Definitely. And being able to, I don't know if this is the right word for it, but have a safe space to do that, right? Because in the real
Yeah.
world, if you mess up, like there are
There's,
consequences in there. Whereas in video games, it's there might be, you might lose your souls or whatever, and
yeah.
like you just go back in and you just do it again, and
Yeah. And in the real world, it's a lot harder to set your difficulty too.
Mhm.
You're given circumstances, and sometimes you don't know how to level up. You don't know how to find, the right gear to deal with that. You just kind of get hammered. And so that can be a lot harder to find the will to persevere, and yeah, it's that option is not available in real life in many cases. And so we got to get kind of a lot more creative or resourceful, or I guess just lucky sometimes when we're trying to move forward.
Definitely. Well, and the key is also trying to find out, like, how do we take, is it transferable too, right? I think to a certain extent it is, of this perseverance that you develop in the game can actually translate to real life. And you see that in
Yeah.
some people, and I think that's kind of what people are getting at with these, Dark Souls saved me, is that they were able to find a way to make that link and that jump.
Yeah, Peterson talks about this too. I remember him talking about I think he had a story about one of his clients who was claustrophobic. And
Mhm.
so he told her to like, spend some time like just standing in front of an elevator, and like don't go in, just stand there and like get to the point where you can stand near an elevator. Okay, now, like take another step closer to the elevator. Okay, like eventually we're going to go into the elevator, but we're not going to close the doors. And there's like all these, steps that this person could slowly take to overcome their claustrophobia. And then he was saying that when that happens, they're not reducing their claustrophobia. They're increasing their resilience. They're increasing their courage. And so that now transfers to all these other parts of their life where, because they were able to, overcome their fear of being in the elevator, now they're able to overcome all sorts of fears that don't even have to do with closed spaces. They might be more assertive at work, or like, there's all sorts of things that transfers to.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, of course, like it makes sense that these games would be therapeutic in that sense, because they allow you to set that thresholds of, how far from the elevator you want to be. And even though the stakes are low, I definitely think there's something transferable there.
Yeah. Well, and one thing that I kind of want to shift it this way, because I'm curious to hear what you think, but one thing that might be surprising to people to hear about the positive psychological benefits of Dark Souls is like the atmosphere of these games for the most part is really bleak,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of influence from Berserk, which has its own, like, it's also very bleak and depressing in many ways. And at first glance, if somebody was to say, like, to show a random, mother, like, oh, this video game will help improve your child's psychological
Yeah.
state or whatever, they'd be like, what in the world? No, like, that's gonna
Right.
make them more depressed or whatever. But it's interesting to have this.
Well, and
Yeah.
honestly, dude, I think that there are some people where that is true. I think some
Hmm.
people do, because we have this kind of selection bias where it's like no one's going to make a video where it's like, I played Dark Souls for 10 minutes and I hated it and I uninstalled it, right? So like we see all
Yeah.
these positive responses to the game online and all these, people that it's transformed. But I have some friends, some normie friends who I'm like, you've got to play this game, and they try it and they're like, this is way too hard, I don't want to do this, like I don't have time to deal
Yeah.
with this, like I can't even get past the tutorial boss, this is frustrating, like I'm gonna, and it's not fun for them. And it's like, okay, fair enough, it's not necessarily for everyone. But yeah, no matter how much I try, I try to convince them, like, just
I
push
feel
through
that
it. And
too.
they're like, I got other games I can play, So, but no, I love what you're saying about the atmosphere of the game, because there's a pacing to it as well, right? Like, it'll be bleak and bleak and bleak, and then suddenly there will be moments where you have like a really incredible view of the level, or like
Hmm.
where you can like kind of like look back and you can see the whole castle that you just like got through. You get to the top and you look down and it's like, oh, there's these moments of like genuine you know setting aesthetic beauty that you get to encounter too, and then you go right back into the bleakness. But it's not just like bleak start to finish.
Exactly, yeah. And one thing that came to my mind, and I don't think I've ever talked about this with anybody, but when I play a video game a lot, there'll be times where I start a game and I see an enemy, and they register as an enemy in my mind, but I don't know if it's some weird form of like Stockholm syndrome or something. But if I go through it enough, I map on like, oh no, this enemy is like, I have like good associations. I have like friendly associations with these
Yeah.
enemies. And I want to say it's something linked to, I don't know if you've heard anything from Rafe Kelly, but he does parkour and he talks to John Vervaeke about some of these things. I think it was on Jordan Peterson as well, but he talks about how in parkour there's this remapping of obstacles to environment, and that like this is no longer an obstacle but a piece of the environment I can use. And
Okay. Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
instead of a wall, this is a thing I can jump off of, and instead of a fence, this is a thing I can slide under, and these kind of things. Like it's now part of the flow state. It's no
Yeah.
longer
Yeah.
something that gets in the way. um and that's been something really interesting, I think, also about Dark Souls and the way that they do their levels and stuff. And but is that an experience you've had? Because I might just be weird
Yeah.
in that sense.
Yeah, and I mean, it becomes part of the canvas that you're painting with, right? Like, as you master the level, you find like a ledge that you can jump off for a plunging attack or something like that. Especially when you start to throw like PvP invasions in there,
Hmm.
people get insanely creative when it's like a player versus another player encounter. There's all sorts of cool emergent stuff that happens there. Um, but yeah, I definitely think that. Um, I definitely think that remapping occurs. It's funny. I just saw Peterson give a lecture where he says like the same thing, but kind of in reverse. He was talking about a chair and
Mm.
how like you see a chair as a thing to sit on, but then if you have like a bunch of chairs that are in your way, you need to get across the stage. The chair is no longer a sitting thing. It's a blocking thing. It's an obstacle that you have to get in the way. That's in your way. And so yeah, the goal. And Vervaeke talks about this all the time, but the goal you have in mind is what determines the nature of the object. And that's not just like symbolically true, that's like ontologically true. Like,
Mm.
things exist in the form of, depending on what your goal is, that transforms the identity of the objects in the world around you. Um, so yeah, like, you take a game like Dark Souls, and if your goal is to make the game more difficult, then you can suddenly, the things that are supposed to be challenges are part of they're just part of the playground, right? They're like a tool to make things more interesting. I don't know if you ever watched Epic Name Bro. He did some of the first Dark Souls playthroughs when the game first came out, and he actually has a line in one of his playthroughs where he says almost exactly what you just said. He's in the first level, Undead Burg, and he comes up upon the Black Knight, who's like this really high level enemy that's kind of out of
Mhm.
place in the first level. And he sees him and he goes, like, there's this moment where it's like, this old, I like, it's a fond memory, even though this thing's about to try to kill him, and it's like way stronger than the character is at this point. And he says, even the enemies in Dark Souls are like old friends,
Yeah,
and that's definitely how you feel after you've played through the game a few times.
definitely. Yeah, and I think that's been true for, I'm trying to think of games that it's been that way for outside of like the Souls like genre. But Sekiro also did that a lot for me. Like they were just um, it provided a lot of ways to just I don't know. The Sekiro is so interesting to me as a game that they kind of went a different, complete direction with, but carried over a lot of the DNA indirectly, um, and it shows a certain kind of full mastery of the genre itself, being able to do that. Um, but just the ability to navigate environments in ways that using grappling hooks and jumping and being able to sneak behind enemies um, and seeing that, okay, now I can have more freedom in how to navigate this, and then being able to introduce challenges in unique ways to be able to take advantage and challenge the player more. That's always that was something I also need to go back to. I need to go back to some of these games and really think about that more.
Yeah, Sekiro is interesting because you have to, because of the way they design the levels, you have to pay a different kind of attention than you do in the other Souls games. Like I was pretty good at finding all the secret areas and items and stuff in Dark Souls and in Elden Ring. But in Sekiro, I missed all kinds of stuff in my first playthrough. Like when because I'll usually play through the game once and then not look anything up. And then, after the first playthrough is finished, then it's kind of like, okay, the embargo is lifted and now, spoilers are allowed and people can tell me what I missed on the stream or whatever, or I'll Google stuff. And in Sekiro, I missed all kinds of stuff like that I would never in a million years have found. And yeah, it's like you have to pay a different kind of attention just to the environments and to what's in front of you, because it's really just like from this like one or two extra tools that you didn't have in the other games that causes that. So it's really interesting.
And the approach to difficulty, I think, was super interesting too. Like this, not having, like leveling wasn't the same. It wasn't like you could just boost up any specific stats. There was a certain amount of like, you just have to find items in the environment to do that. And I think that was helpful. I don't know. I'm the kind of player that I hate it, but I want to optimize everything. And so I'm slowly teaching myself not to do that. And that was a great game that basically took that away from me, being like, okay, this is something you can't do. Now just play the game that we have in front of you. I'm like, okay, I can do that. And I'll trust that in the hands of someone else. And for me, it worked out. I know for some people it was a bit more of a challenge, but yeah.
That's why I like the player versus player stuff, because optimizing it, especially like in the FromSoft games, you can optimize the difficulty completely out of the game, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, because I'm the same way. I love min-maxing, and like in MMOs or in PvP games, you need to squeeze out like every little bit of advantage that you have, because the players you're going against are doing the same thing. But in a lot of these games where it's like, in a Dark Souls type game, as much as people say that it's difficult, like if you actually min-max every aspect of the game, it's not going to be difficult at all. And so you kind of have to, you actually, you kind of will ruin the fun for yourself if you're too strategically minded as you go through it. So you got to be careful there.
Isn't that the Sid Meier quote that if you give the player the opportunity, they'll optimize the fun out of any game? And I think that's the one I come back to is how do you make a way that players won't try to find a meta game to it? And I don't know if there is a way. I have mentioned this to Neil in the past. I don't know if you were familiar with this story, but I think it was one of the Wolfenstein games. It was like the deathmatch mode. Players would drop their side's gun to pick up the enemy's gun because they thought it was stronger, even though they both had the same stats. The only difference between them was the model and the sound effect used. And
interesting.
All the players would post on the forums about how the other team is so overpowered. And they looked at the stats, and the other team was getting more kills, or like with that weapon. Whoever had the weapon actually was getting more kills with that sound effect, and there wasn't a bug involved. And what they did was they just changed the sound effect for the other player's team to be a little bit more punchier. And with that, it evened out again. And people thought that they had buffed the other team's gun. But in honesty, it was the perception of how good the gun was.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, what comes to mind for me there is cheating in these games, because like especially, I think it may be a little bit harder to get away with it nowadays, but like in the early MMO days, like in Ultima Online in particular, there was a time a few years into the game where cheating became super rampant, and I remember like talking to the people who are on my team and being like, what's going on here, and they would always say, well, the people on the other team are cheating, and so we have to cheat. And what was interesting about Ultima Online in particular is, when I loved like playing the spy, and so I would always have characters in multiple guilds, and so I would see kind of behind the curtain, right? So I knew players A and I knew players B, and I knew who was cheating and who wasn't. And people always thought that other people were cheating even when they weren't cheating, because they would just like, the way that they move, the other player moves on your screen, it's like, well, I can't move like that, so he must be speed hacking, right? And I had pretty good relationships with people on both sides of the fence, so I could like kind of low-key ask like, hey, like, are you using such and such, like, do you have cheat engine installed, like what's going on here? And people would admit it if they were, right? They'd be like, oh, yeah, this is what I, like, don't tell anyone, but this is what I've been doing. And so I had a pretty good idea of who was authentically playing the game and who wasn't. But people would always, like by a huge margin, they would always assume that the other side was using these cheats, and then as like word got out that the cheats existed, that like created this thing where, oh, well, now that we know it exists, for sure everyone else is doing it, and because everyone else is doing it, now I have to do it. And within like, I remember there was one point in the game where it felt like over just a few months, it went from like one guy on each side who was cheating to like one guy on each side who wasn't cheating. Like it went from like a 1% thing to like a 99% thing within like a few months of this, just ramping up. So, yeah, that was
It's fascinating.
Yeah, it was fascinating, but it was sad too, because it ruined the game, and a lot of people.
Yeah.
I quit during that time because it was like, oh, like, well, I guess if we're gonna have to compete now, then we have to do this. And people accused me, because I'd played the game for years at this point, and I was pretty good. And people from the other team would accuse me of cheating constantly. And then the funny thing was, like, I had a fallout with my guild, and I left the guild. And as soon as I left the guild, all the people that I had played with for years suddenly were accusing me of cheating. And it's like, I'm performing at the exact same way that I was when I was on your guys' side. But now that you have to go against me, you're perceiving it as cheating. Whereas when I was with you, you just thought I was a good player. And so, yeah, very interesting.
Definitely. Huh. And I think this gets to a little bit of my difficulty with metagaming too, is how do you avoid it? Because I think that's what kills a lot of games, is this kind of wanting to not wanting to actually play the real game, but wanting to win, and not having like a correct goal. Peterson would put it like, you want your kid to be able to be the one who's invited to the most games, and not the one who's winning all the time. And so how do you foster that environment? In games, I think that's really difficult. But
I think this actually ties really closely to what we were saying earlier about resilience, because like when I think about my own arc as a gamer, like 16-year-old me cared way more about winning than 36-year-old me. Like if I'm in a situation now where I'm playing a game and I'm winning every time, that's boring, right? Like I want to change the teams. I want to even things out. I want to, do something to where there's a challenge and where everyone's having fun. Like that stuff is more important to me now. But as a teenager, if I'm winning every game, that's like perfect, right? I'm dominating, I'm better than you, I'm talking trash. Like that is, that's the goal. And I think that the reason that I care more now about the challenge and about other people having fun and things like that is because it's just maturity, right? Like I think I have
Mhm.
grown up and my ego is not as fragile as it was when I was a 16-year-old. I didn't need all that validation. I didn't need to feel good about or I nowadays I don't need to feel as good about myself from beating someone in a video game as I did when I was 16, right?
Yeah.
And so you can see, and you can see like different gaming communities have different levels of maturity too.
Mhm.
It's one of the reasons I still like to play a lot of these old school games is because people have grown up, and a lot of them have kids now, a lot of them have mellowed out, and so even in the most competitive environments, there's an element of like sportsmanship there. Whereas with some games like like League of Legends or something like that comes to mind, it's like the maturity level of the player base is kind of like eternally super low, and like everyone will get like mad at the slightest little thing, and everyone's talking as much trash as they can possibly get away with without getting banned. um and it's like, yeah, it's, I don't know, I think they just haven't developed that resilience yet. Like losing is still a huge deal and winning is still a huge deal, and um it's a huge deal in like a very like ego, sense of self-worth sort of thing. Once you build up a sense of self-worth that's not based on winning or losing in a video game, then you care less about, you still want to win, you still want to be competitive, you still want the challenge, and you still want the rush of winning, but um, the challenge becomes more important than the actual outcome.
Yeah. Oh, you're mentioning that reminded me of something that I found really fascinating was this relationship that Bobby Fischer had with chess. Um, when he was playing, he was the best player in the world, and there was a point where that's all he was doing. He was just studying chess alone in his room because no one could teach him to play chess better because he's the best, and so
Right.
he just is miserable. Um, and he's just memorizing moves. And by the end of his life, he's talking about how much he hates chess. Like he retired and then he started doing interviews, and that's all he would talk about. It's just like, I hate this game. And so how do you make it better? Because even then you couldn't cheat at chess at that point. Like there's no way. You just played the game. And what he noted was this metagame of memorizing opening moves was killing the game, because
Yeah.
if you had to memorize the opening moves, then half the games have already been played that people want to play. And so you're basically your opening is a much bigger part of the game, and then the end game is pretty much set. And so there's very little like dynamic creative chess being played, and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
it's constantly shrinking. And so his idea was to, like you were saying, like have a randomizer and to both randomize both sides of the board, and then play some completely new game that there is no theory for. And so you could just try it out, and then both players play on the other side, so it's balanced, so both players completely understand it. And it hasn't caught on, but that was his
Well, it's
idea.
hard. Yeah, it would be hard to do that with chess because a high level chess player um, could probably look at a certain set of those randomizations, maybe let's say like 80% of them, and already know the outcome, right? Like if they're playing against another high level player,
Mhm.
um, I don't know if it would actually solve the problem, right? Like if you're um, if one player had a really good configuration where they were able to like
Oh, it
launch
would be
their
mirrored,
pieces
by the
forward.
way. That was
Oh,
part
so
of it.
both pieces. I see what you mean. I see what you
Yeah.
mean. Um, yeah, yeah, I could see that being interesting. I wonder why that hasn't caught on. I'm surprised. Like you have randomizers in all these other games, and chess is like making such a big comeback right now. I wonder why there hasn't been that. I wonder if part of it is that because I think we're discovering this a little bit with AI too. Sometimes the metagame with things that we think are solved will suddenly be shaken up again, either
Mhm.
by like a really ingenious player, or now that we have AI is doing stuff where people are like, oh, I know, like we've been playing chess for all these years and no one ever thought to do that. Um, and so there's we can think of like a spectrum of how much dynamic creative play is available, you know, like tic-tac-toe. Pretty much everyone knows, you know, if you go here, the other person's going to go here. There's not a lot of like dynamic room there. And then chess, it's like, okay, the first half of the game is memorized, but the second half is all dynamic. But I mean, just the other day, I didn't like investigate this, so I don't know how true it is, but I saw a headline that said something along the lines of like weird new chess opening is making everyone have to like rethink their strategies. And so
Oh,
someone
okay.
figured out some off meta opening, and it's like now all the memorized stuff doesn't work anymore.
Mhm.
Because someone's doing this weird, you know, seemingly suicidal play, but they're somehow making it work because, you know, so um, yeah, so I think there is kind of like there's probably some measurable range of how dynamic a game could be, but also I think sometimes that's just an illusion because I see this happen in
Mhm.
online games all the time. And it's great for a content creator actually, because when a new game comes out, very few people will creatively attempt to push the meta forward. What they
Yeah.
will do is they will go online and they will look at the best strategy and then they will just do that.
Mhm.
And so um, a lot of times because there's so few people actually being creative and coming up with new strategies as a content creator, it's like, well, no one's tried this thing over here before, why don't I see if this works? And then if it worked, it's like boom, I've got all these views on YouTube and I've got all these people watching my stream, and it's like sometimes these aren't even like very smart strategies. It's just nobody has bothered to try that yet. And so, you know, you
Yeah.
try a few things and something works and suddenly you're like getting all this attention for it. And I think that the rigid metagame thing is way worse than it's ever been. Like
Mhm.
at this point in history, the likelihood of a player coming up with their own strategy rather than looking up one online is at an all-time low.
Yeah.
Which means the potential for, you know, a YouTuber to get all the credit for that is at an all-time high. So you know, it's nice from like a YouTuber perspective, but um, they've actually been measuring this. I saw Asmongold just did a video where he reacted to a study where they literally went in and concluded that players are like, you know, 60% less strategic, or like you know, less likely to come up with a strategy, or less likely to like they're like measuring a decline in people's ability to creatively solve problems in the video game world.
Mhm.
And this is like a, you know, like an objective study that was done. um, and it was really interesting to like see how they measured that, and how see like the timeline that, you know, of which it's dropped off, like just in the last, you know, 10 years even, it's been this like huge decline.
Yeah. It's fascinating. There was one thing that came to mind too with kind of breaking metagames in the design. It was relatively recent in CS:GO where you had a certain, I think it was like the SG, the scoped rifle that's like that's not like an op or like a sniper, and it was at a higher price than all the other rifles, and so economy and meta would say that you should buy this other one and you could get other stuff, and the meta was developing that, you know, you only buy these guns, you never buy these guns, and then out of nowhere, the developers lowered the price of these other guns, ran the experiment basically, and people started using them and finding out how good they were, and found out
Yeah.
that they were the meta, and then after that period was over, they re-increased the price to the original price, and people were using that one more still,
Yeah.
despite the old meta. And so, yeah, it's a constant problem of like, especially as a game developer, how do you find ways to keep players from doing this, because it's not fun normally for most people. Most people are just they're that's part of the fun is finding out what works for you, and what strategies that you like
Well,
and not.
yeah, and the problem grows for developers as creativity and strategic thinking decreases in the player base. Balancing actually becomes a larger problem for a developer, because if you have a bunch of highly creative beta testers, you can figure out balancing 10 times faster than if you have one creative beta tester and a bunch of people who just copy whatever he does because he happens to win in the first few days, right? Like,
Yeah.
how are you going to balance around that? And so then you tweak and you buff a different gun, and then like people actually try that gun, and it turns out the gun was already good before you even buffed it. So now it's way too good, and you've made the problem worse, actually, right? And now you're like swinging back and forth. I see that happen a lot. Yeah, I see that happen a lot in especially in online competitive games nowadays, where it's like I feel for some of the developers, because and then like the people who play these games are so grumpy too. They're like, stupid, idiot devs can't balance the game, and it's like, man, it's a challenge though, because if no one's trying anything, then they're not getting the feedback they used to get about like what's balanced and what's not. It's a way larger burden that falls on the shoulders of just the developer to come up with all this stuff themselves.
Definitely. Yeah. And it comes back again, like what is the game that's actually being played? Because if you I don't know, I may be harping on this too much, but like I want to have fun. Like I don't want to play against a bunch of players who are all playing the same strategy. I want to see something unique and something new. And it's there's something beautiful about having this like dynamic system where once you feel like you fully understand a system, you can take any piece of it and use it to its full potential. And for the most part, it's okay, we're going to stick with this one thing because I can get really good at it.
So the other thing, I used to see this in League of Legends all the time, for example, where other players, if you're playing a team game, other players will enforce the meta on you, even if they're objectively wrong, right? Like they don't know that. All they know is the meta. And so if you pick an off meta character, then your team will flame you, right? They will. So there's this huge social pressure to stick with the meta and not do anything creative. And that makes the problem even worse again. And some people, like, when I was playing ranked League, this was a long time ago, but I would pick an off meta character, and some people would just leave the game. Some people would like take an automatic loss to their rank. This was like at a very high level. It was very hard to grind ranks at this point. People would rather just start a new game and take an instant hit to their loss. Like there's no worse outcome you could have. You might as well try to win, right? Like the worst thing that could happen is you're just going to take the loss that you are inflicting on yourself anyways. But people would still just like instantly leave the game and take the hit to their rank, just because you picked a character they didn't like, and so like you have to be really resilient, again, like to come back to that word, to even try to get outside the box, because you have to pick the character, and then you have to withstand everyone being like, hey, idiot, like what's wrong with you? You can't make any mistakes in the game, right? Because if you do anything even slightly wrong in the game, if you die even a single time, even if your teammates have 4 or 5 deaths, as soon as you die once, it's your fault that everything is going wrong, right? Because you picked the bad character. And so you have to play perfectly. You have to execute at a super high level. And if you do all those things correctly, then at the end of the game, people will be like, hey, sorry for what I said. But 99% of the time, you're not going to do everything perfectly, and people are going to blame you for what happened. And, it's so like that, they're just going to continue to enforce that same boring, pattern that everyone else has been playing. And yeah, it's hard. It's hard to, and when these team games, it's like, there's even more pressure to keep that locked in.
Definitely. And I think that carries over to the real world as well. Like I don't know. I see online there's the strategies people have for living their life, and so they wanna say like, okay, this is the way you do it, and everybody's gonna fit into this box, and we're gonna do this.
Yeah.
You need to start your drop shipping company, and you need to start buying, Chinese manufactured like things, and you need to start selling them on eBay for triple the price, and make that have that be your side hustle, so you can buy a house, and then you can start a real estate company. And and so
this is the meta.
Yeah, and I think all of this has to do with like the goal piece too, of what are we shooting for, and if your goal is money, then you can optimize for that, and you might be right or wrong, but what are you aiming any higher? Are you aiming for something that are you aiming for meaning? I think that's a major thing that Peterson would kind of point to, of like even a
Yeah.
subjective feeling of meaning is missing
Yeah.
sometimes.
So I started talking about this a little bit when I went back to church, because I assumed church people would kind of see where I was coming from, and people would stare at me so blankly that I just stopped bringing it up, because I've been struggling with what I want to do with my career, because I did the
Mhm.
streaming and YouTube thing for 7 years, um, and then I kind of converted back to Christianity. And in that process, I became like much more meaning oriented. And there was a part of me that was like, hey, when I was younger, it seemed like a really good idea to just play video games all day and get paid for it.
Mhm.
But now that I'm older, it's like, I wonder if there's something more useful that I can do. But when I would tell that to people, they would just look at me like I was an idiot, right? They were like, "What do you mean? Like, just keep playing the video games and making money playing video? Like, what useful? Who cares? Like, like it doesn't even
Yeah.
compute." And I get it, because a lot of people um, maybe didn't have that opportunity, and maybe they are already at a job that they kind of don't like, and so it's like, oh, boo-hoo, you don't like your job playing video games. Like, they can't really empathize with that. So I get it. But I thought, like, at least in church, some people would be like, oh yeah, like, I know what you mean, like, I think about that too. No, not a single. It was all just like,
Yeah.
I don't, huh, like, what are you saying right now? And Yeah, so there was something else I was going to say in response to what you said, but now it slipped away.
Well, feel free to bring it up when you remember. But I've had some
Oh,
similar stuff.
I
Oh, go
I
ahead.
I know what it was. Sorry. So, as far as like the meta thing applying to real life, it's funny because actually I feel like that did happen to me with streaming. Like, um, I wanted to get into streaming years before I actually did, and the reason I didn't is because everyone in my life was like, "No, you can't do that." Right? Like, that's not
Hmm.
meta. You know. Um, and now it's way more common than it was
Yeah.
10, 12 years ago. So if I brought it up now, then maybe people would be like, oh yeah, there are a lot of people making money to do that. You could do, but back in, 2010 or 2012 or whatever, like trying to tell my dad, oh, I'm going to play video games online and make money off of it. He was like, what are you talking about? Like, you finish your degree, like, go work for a real company, um, and there is some wisdom to that, right? Because it's kind of like picking the wrong character in League of Legends. Like, um, if anything goes wrong, you're gonna get blamed, And
Hmm.
like when it comes to streaming, 99.9% of people who try it don't make a living off of it.
Yeah.
You can see that right there in the stats. Anyone can look this up. It's a very, um, it's a pretty risky business. So it's like anytime I was financially struggling, the response from friends and family was like, well, maybe it's time to get a real job. And like, they're not wrong, like they're 99.9% correct, right? Like, I have to do everything. I have to like really figure out a way to prove them wrong if I want to prove them wrong. But if everyone followed that meta, then like we wouldn't have any artists, right? We wouldn't have any musicians. We wouldn't have any of these like high risk, low percentage jobs. So it's an interesting balance.
It definitely is. The I've been super interested because I want to say, I think it was Ludwig who would make a lot of videos about this, about like, okay, what went into becoming a streamer and getting to where I was, and he kind of put together a PowerPoint and kind of talked about it. And it was just fascinating to kind of see this balance between like, most people are not going to make it, but this might be worth trying. So how do you do this? And also,
Yeah.
this is the meta that worked for me, but it's not going to work for you because it's over, right? Like um it worked for me because it was a very specific point in time, and you're going to have to do something different, but I can't tell you what you need to do different because I'm already there. So how do you even
Yeah.
talk about it? And so, yeah, it's fascinating to see that as kind of like, that's also true of this relationship between parents and children. Like, how do you communicate that the world is changing really fast, and so I can give you advice, and I can only give you advice based off of what I've lived and what I've seen in other people's lives, but I can't tell you exactly what you need to know. And that's there's a lot of humility there, and it's also just really difficult.
Yeah, man. And the thing, when it comes to like children or just other people in general, it's like what is the right amount of difficulty? Is it coming all the way back to Dark Souls? It's like I've seen people who make life too easy on their kids and it destroys them, right? But no one wants their kids to suffer. No one wants their kids to have hardship that they don't have to have. So it's like, how do you find the right balance to those things? That's super difficult. That's something I think about all the time. I'm hoping to settle down and start a family within the next few years. And I think about that all the time. That's so tough.
Definitely. And one thing that I've kind of been processing is well, part of the reason I started making videos in the first place was because I came to the realization I don't feel like I have proficiency in anything. Like I have all these things. I have like what I do for work, and I
know.
Science.
I'm laughing because I know exactly what you mean. Like, yeah.
But I'm like,
a lot of potential, but yeah.
Yeah, and if anybody asks me, and people do, they say like, "Oh, what are you good at?" And I'm like, "Oh,
I can beat Dark Souls without dying."
Exactly. And I'm not very good at PvP, and so I don't spend a lot of time in that, and so I couldn't even say that. I couldn't even say like, "Oh, I have a good friend who's like top 50 in a character in Apex Legends or something like that." And so I can't even say that. I'm like I'm really good at playing single player RPGs. That's what I'm able to do. And so just trying to find a way to like, okay, how do I find a situation that is sufficiently difficult that will challenge me? And even if nothing comes of it, at least I did it, or at least I tried, and try to build up that resilience. And that's a thing that's been very helpful for me, but it's also a difficult task of like even coming to a conclusion on what that thing should be. There's a million kind of ways you could go with that.
Yeah, so. I was going to ask, have you arrived at anything or?
Well, so I started all this because I have a friend who every year he takes on a different like challenge of something he wants to learn, and he just takes a year to do it. So he's been like he's crazy. He was a volunteer firefighter. He was an ice climber. He was a professional diver for like a fishing company. He was in underground boxing for a while. Okay. So he's just done everything. Like and I think this latest year was Warhammer because his brother's really into Warhammer. And so he's like, okay, well, he's into it. Like, let me just dive into it. So there was a while where he was living in the van outside of my house, and he would be painting his Warhammer figures, listening to the Warhammer lore podcast.
Yeah, I think if you're painting Warhammer figures, you have to live in a van. So that makes sense. Yeah.
So he inspired me very much. I'll be like, okay, well, man, this guy's doing it. Well, I can do something. So I put together a list of a bunch of stuff, and then I said, on my birthday, that's gonna be my first day, and I'm just gonna take a year and do that, and then try to make this a tradition too, and just go through with it. So that's what I've been doing here. That's been my thought, is just to make videos and try that at least as a form of doing that.
Well, it's cool because it sounds like your friend is doing that across like multiple different genres. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like it's not all intellectual stuff. It's not all physical stuff. It's not all creative stuff. Like he's doing a bunch of different things. Like I know, at the risk of sounding cliche, one of the big things that helped me to be like a more well-rounded person was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Mm-hmm. Because like I grew up super nerdy and playing video games all the time, and played like flag football in junior high or whatever, but never like did any serious sports in high school or beyond. And so like I felt like that was a big thing that was missing for me, was like physical strength and coordination and like mastery over my breathing, mastery over my body, the ability to like keep it together in a violent scenario, you know, like all these things. And yeah, when I started training BJJ, it's crazy how I heard someone use the phrase like it turns the volume down on everything else in your life. Like it was crazy how the suffering that I experienced in other parts of my life or other difficulty that I encountered all decreased as a result of me going in and getting like wrapped up in a pretzel and like, you know, having my neck cranked or whatever, like, and having to figure out my way out of that, you know, like it was so transferable. Like I feel like it's one of the most transferable things I've ever done, was just going in and getting you know just grappling against people that were way stronger, way better than me, and having to just stick with that for months and eventually years, you know.
Yeah. Well, that's what I've heard a lot about martial arts specifically. Like you're saying that there is a certain cliche, but I mean, there's a reason why. It's because it's been super helpful for a lot of people of being able to, I don't know, you be embodied in this process of, and the proximal development, all this bit of like bringing that into the real world. I mean, to a certain extent, martial arts is the Dark Souls of like physical fitness. It's you're allowed to fail. Like you have you're sparring with somebody sometimes, and being able to fail in a safe place where, you know, if you got into a fight in the real world, there's a chance that you die, but here you can learn from that and grow from it.
Yeah, it can be hard to find the right zone of development in jiu-jitsu, though. You gotta get kind of lucky with your training partners. There's been times where I'm training and it's like the people are so much farther ahead of me that I'm just like tapping every like 20 seconds, and I'm like, I don't even know what I would do to improve here. You know, I just feel like I'm wasting my time. And like, I'm like, are you like, I was wondering in those scenarios, I'm like, is the other person even getting anything out of this? This is like, you know, this is like easy mode for them, right? This is like level 1. So they're not improving. I'm not improving. We're kind of just like wasting our time. But even in those scenarios, like, I mean, sometimes you don't have a choice. You got to figure something out. And even if it's not the optimal zone for development, it's like, man, eventually, very, very slowly, you'll grind something out.
Yeah. Well, you need something, right? And you're only given what you have, basically, and you just have to make it work.
Yeah. You can't always set your own difficulty. Even in these safe, you know, spaces, you can't always set your difficulty the way you want it.
Definitely. I wanted to go back a little bit to what you were saying about like people in church, because I've had a little bit of this experience too of this. I don't know, especially stuff around the TLC. Like I want to be able to express some of this stuff, and I always feel like I fail, and I'll say something, and then the room just is quiet, and like nobody wants to talk about any of this stuff, and so I don't know. I've been trying to find a way to, I don't know, to make it something that can be connected to, but it's been really hard, and I don't know how to frame it exactly.
It is really hard. Yeah, I find that. So I think I kind of have an understanding of why that is. So Paul did a video not too long ago where he was going over, I forget whose analysis it was, but he was talking about how conservatives leave the church in groups and liberals leave the church as individuals. And so I think what happens, you know, if we go to like Peterson's work on personality and politics, generally people who are very high in openness tend to be more leaning to the left. People who are very low in openness tend to be leaning to the right. So you go to a church, and if it's a conservative church, then people who are more left leaning or more high in openness are going to come to the church. They're going to hear something that they don't like, and they're just going to leave, right? Whereas like you know, if the church starts to lean left, if the church starts to get more open, all the conservatives will like get mad, and then they'll either force that openness out of the institution, or they will split the church in half and they will like leave as a group, right?
Yeah.
And so the church is constantly feeling this sort of not all church, obviously some churches, you know, have split and are very liberal, but like the church I go to is fairly conservative, and I can feel the pressure there. You know, I can feel like the low openness kind of
Hmm.
the thing that you're talking about, where it's like you throw something else a little risky or a little creative or maybe a little offensive or whatever, and it's like people don't like that, people don't want that, you know. And um, a person who is very creative, very open, is going to feel repelled from that space, and they're just going to leave, which is then going to reinforce the dynamic of a bunch of low openness conservatives who are just kind of like, you know, mirroring each other's opinions on something. Um, and so, yeah, I think it's hard. You know, again, you have to be willing to break the meta a little bit.
Hmm.
There are definitely, I think there are definitely other, especially now with Peterson and Peugeot and all these online thinkers that are creating these bridges. I think um, now more than ever there is a willingness of high openness people to try church, whereas before it would just been like categorically like, oh, I know what that's going to be
Yeah.
like, I'm not going to try that. That was me for a long time. But you know, I think there is an openness or a willingness now for high openness people to try church. And so because of that, like I would say keep the possibility open that you will connect with someone who is, you know, like it might be only like a 10% chance, but you know, maybe even if they don't speak up or react right away, that I'm sure there are other people in that space that are kind of like connecting with what you're saying. And I hope that that's something that will start to change over time. You know, maybe we can get to a point where more high openness people feel comfortable with bringing these ideas up, um, and I think a lot of the like big churches are learning to relax a little bit and welcome more of that. I certainly don't feel, maybe I just got lucky, but like the church that I attend, I don't feel like it's nearly as, you know, like rigid as I remember church being 10 or 15 years ago. Um, but yeah, I'll say some off the wall stuff in Bible studies because I really love, you know, the Peugeot symbolism deep dive stuff.
Hmm.
And so, you know, I'll start talking to people about like how, you know, like the number 6 is, you know, the number of man, and the number 7 is the number of creation. And so when we see this number here, like it's like an attempt to, you know, encapsulate everything. And, you know, why does Saul wait till the end of the 6th day to make his sacrifice when he was supposed to wait for the prophet Samuel? And all, you know, I'll go into all this like symbolism. And sometimes people will be like, whoa, that's like so profound. And I never thought of it that way. And like, I'll get this super positive reaction. And then sometimes I'll go into it and people are just like, oh, okay. Yeah, thanks for sharing. And then like, you know, next, like,
Yeah.
right. So it's like, yeah, it's a gamble, right? Like with anything creative, it's a gamble, and you know it'll land differently on different groups of people. But yeah, that's been my experience with it.
Definitely. I don't think I've run quite into like the taboo space yet. But I have had a little bit of like I don't even know what's going on really. Like I think it might just be like I don't know. Like I don't have it like in the mind of the other person. Like I don't have anything to add to that. Like you're going on your own adventure over there, and like I
You're
don't
on your
know.
own branch of the tree. Yeah.
Yeah. And so my goal has been I've put together not yet. I'm putting together an estuary at my church, and so that's where I'm kind of going with it. So it's a little bit more self-selected in that form of like probably the higher in openness people will show up, and
Yeah.
there's a little bit of like more expectation in that space for something like that. And I think that's where I'm headed, and I think that would reflect a little bit better on I can keep all the crazy stuff a little bit more out of the Bible study and a little bit more towards estuary, and we can
Yeah.
balance this out a little bit more.
It's tough. I mean, I can't speak to the dynamics at your church, but I try to do something similar at my church. We started a group. where the whole purpose of the group was for people to ask like tough questions about the Bible or about God or whatever. And we wanted people to invite their non-Christian friends. And so we were expecting kind of a mix. We were hoping for kind of like a 50-50 blend of believers and non-believers. And that's not what happens at all. It quickly became like there were people there that I knew were skeptical or were not fully bought into like certain doctrine or whatever, that still would behave they would use like very Christianese language because of that like group dynamic. Like they could still feel, we were still meeting in a church building, and like, so it was very hard to create a space where people felt open. And I at one point kind of tried to lead by example, and this totally backfired. But I brought up some like kind of controversial interpretations about certain parts of the Bible. And I was like, well, if we look at the original Greek, it doesn't really say this. And like, we teach this in the church, but like, I haven't really been able to find this in scripture. So I was kind of like throwing out some arguments that were, sort of against the established doctrine, hoping that would like loosen up the group a little bit to, have their disputes. And what ended up happening is that one of the other leaders of the group got like really upset with that, and we had to like have a whole meeting about it. And then like she talked to the pastor of the church, and like I told him that I was like teaching incorrect, doctrine and leading people astray. And it's like, the whole purpose of the group was to work through these things. This wasn't a typical Bible study. It was explicitly a tough questions about God group. But even in that space, that pressure was still there. And so it's tough, man. It's tough. I have a real big heart for trying to build something like that, but I really only see it online. I haven't, I really respect what Paul has been able to do with his estuary groups, because when I tried it, it was tough. It was tough.
Yeah. I had something and then I lost it, but yeah, this is what I was going to bring up. I was trying to reduce the level of detail so that I didn't, I'm not exposing this person or whatever, but somebody was talking to me about an experience they had, and they were able to share a message for a youth group they were working with as like one of the leaders. And it was a Bible series on like where to see God. And so they're going on like, okay, goal, God in the church, God in, this place and that place, whatever, and like nature and all this kind of stuff. And he did God in the culture, and he was pointing out like, oh, like look at these lyrics of these songs that are written by non-Christians. Look at how, despite them not being a Christian and being like totally against faith, you can see like that there is some goodness here, that God is still working in this place, and trying to like expand this view of like, oh, okay, like it doesn't have to have a Christian stamp of approval on it to show that God can work outside of where you expect him to, and often is. And that was the message he was trying to give. And at the end of his message, the leader of the group did a summary and said, okay, well, this is what was said tonight. And it was the complete opposite message. It was like, the culture is horrible and you should go to the church to see God moving, or something like that. Or everybody needs to be here all the time, which is like not completely wrong, but it's you're missing the point. Like the whole point is lost if you present it that way. And so and it's that spirit that's in the church, I think, that's just like it so wants to hold tight to, I don't know, it's the openness versus the, I don't know what the opposite of openness is, but the closedness.
It's an autoimmune disease. That's how I like to think about it, because we need an immune system, right? We need Christians who are firm in their faith, who hold a certain doctrine, and when an outside influence comes in, we need them to be able to not just crumble and believe whatever the culture tells them, right? Because the culture is going to go up and down all over the place. Sometimes the culture will get it right, but often it won't. And so we need to be able to excuse me, we need to be able to have that immune system. But you know, an autoimmune disease, or at least a version of autoimmune disease, what happens is your immune system will see something that looks like a pathogen and will attack it, even though it's a healthy part of your body. And that's how
Yeah.
you get autoimmune disease, and yeah, I see that happening in the church constantly. And um, it's almost like it's very predictable that it'll get to that point, because the more dangerous these pathogens become, the more vigilant the immune system has to be. And so it's this, like, in this increasing intensity, where as the culture becomes more and more stray, you have a more and more extreme reaction against it. um, and you can even see this politically, like if you do polls on certain topics, now compared to like 2018, there's like a consistent trend of, kind of like more and more like liberal acceptance of some particular thing, and then like 2018, 2019 it peaks, and then it kind of like starts to go down again as the reaction forms against it.
Oh,
And so, yeah, I mean, it's another one of those things where, like, I don't necessarily blame people, because um, it is a difficult balance. I do see churches that have failed to hold their standards, and that now are accepting of everything, and they become weird. They become untethered, and um, it's difficult to draw the boundaries about what we believe, and people don't like that, and the attendance of those churches go down, and then the attendance of the churches that are steadfast uh, go up, even if they're too extreme, right? Even if they're too rigid. People would rather have, I think, right now at this cultural moment, people would rather have too much structure than the weird everything is everything chaos that the parts of the culture are trying to put forward. So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of the eternal
yeah.
struggle of, order and chaos that we're all trying to balance. And so, yeah, I don't necessarily blame um, people for being overly vigilant, but yeah, it is a problem that I hope we start to wake up to more and more.
Yeah. In my own church, I haven't seen it as much, but I remember, like, in my childhood, my um I don't know, like my parents, then also like the church around me, um would point to certain things and be like, oh, that's bad, and then that would be picked up, and it would, like, Pokemon was one of these things where it's like, oh, like the monsters,
Yeah, Harry
and
Potter
like
and witchcraft was a big
Harry
one when I was a
Potter was a
kid.
big one.
Yeah,
But what was interesting was, like, each time, like, I encountered one of those things, like, as a kid, I'm like, I run into it. I'm like, okay, well, I've heard things about it in the church and people whispering stuff or whatever. But I see it and I'm like, okay, that's cool. And then I ask my parents, and my parents are also part of that. And then I think they might have like a short conversation, and then they just kind of fold on it, and they were like, okay, here you go. They did that for Harry Potter too. They were like, I
yeah,
saw it and I was like, oh, I heard this is good. Hey, can I get Harry Potter from the library? And they're like, oh, like they might say something like, oh, you got to be careful, but yeah, you can read it. And
yeah,
so it's just, um and it kind of all came up to in high school, like late middle school. um I was really interested in, like, oh, I want to try playing D&D. And so I'd asked them about it, and they were really weird about it. And we had this conversation that was like really awkward. And I'm like, I don't think that's what this is. Like, they have all these experiences from the Satanic Panic about, like, oh, kids
right.
killing themselves because their characters died or something. And I at the moment was like, you know what? If this is that big of a deal for you, I'm not gonna play it. Like, it's okay. Like, I will step back. I'm in your home. It's fine. And they ended up getting it for me, and then they handed it to me for my birthday. And then I'm like, okay. And they're like, but like, they had the same attitude too of like, oh, you got to be really careful. And I was like, okay, well, what is going on here? Like, if it's a no, it's a no. It's fine. But like, how
Yeah,
do I how
yeah,
do I process this? Um, and then I encountered the same thing later with like family friends. Of my mom would tell a family friend, oh, like Noah's playing D&D, and they would say like, oh, I'm sure it's better than what it was when we were kids or something like that. And I'm like, what do you mean?
They're just
Like,
kind of give in, and yeah.
well, they give in, but then they would also like still hold on to the old stuff. So it's like the old stuff is still very true. The stuff they were always told as kids or
Right.
as young adults. And the way that they would balance it is like, oh, but it's not as bad now. It's changed, I'm sure, or something like that. And
Yeah.
it was this
Yeah, that's
weird kind of
interesting.
uh I've been processing that. That's kind of loosely related, but it was just something that came to
Well,
my mind.
I mean, most people think as a group, like
Yeah.
this is why Paul always says, like, if you want to become a believer, start hanging out with believers. Like most of the thinking that we do is on a group level. We like to think that we're individual, rational people, but the people you spend your time around, you're going to absorb their beliefs. And if
Yeah.
you don't want to do that, you have to be really careful. And then if you're too careful, you become a weirdo, because now if you really are just thinking on your own, then that's insanity, right? Like, we have to have that looking glass self. We have to use other people to think clearly. You can't think just completely on your own, disconnected from everyone else. Like, you will go insane. So yeah, it's that eternal balance of how much do I let in, how much do I keep out,
Yeah.
and as far as like the people seeing Christian influence in the culture, that's another thing that I love when it comes to video games, because it's like when I just played through Final Fantasy VII Rebirth,
Hmm.
and I'm playing through the game, and I'm like, man, I did not realize as a kid how much Christian thought is imbued in this story. And there are some people at the church where if I started talking to them about some of the themes in Final Fantasy VII, they would think that that was demonic or blasphemous or whatever. But it's like, I love the way Pajot explains this, because it's like, if Christianity is true, then that means that other traditions are going to find pieces of it. Like, anything that's durable, whether it's like Islam or Buddhism or any other tradition that is durable, even a completely secular, lyrics that grab us, like, it's going to be participate in some way in what is the most real thing. So if we think
Hmm.
we have the most real thing, we should expect that other traditions have pieces of it, and it might not look like the way we have it, but of course it's going to show up other places. It's people are in the world, like we're under the same sky. Like, if the sky is real, other people are going to see it too. So
Yeah.
um so yeah, of course other religions are going to have things in them that are true. Of course, music and things that are completely non-Christian, or even completely anti-Christian, are still going to have things where it's like, oh, this is being framed as anti-Christian, but you can see this in our tradition as well. We can make connections there. And I think we have to do that at this point. Like, I think that's the only way. I think that is the way that Christianity comes back and makes itself relevant again in the culture. That's exactly why Jordan Peterson blew up, is because he went through Genesis not as a Christian, but as a psychologist. And it's
Hmm.
like, oh, all this stuff is real outside of the religious dogma. It's just real in the world. It's just real from us. These are just psychological things that we can discover even if we're not believers. And I
Hmm.
think as people understand more and more of that side, then that'll point to the trueness of Christ, and that'll point to the other things in the tradition. But it also might force us to let go of certain things, certain dogmas and doctrines that we've held on to for hundreds of years. And that's the tough part.
Yeah.
That's the tough part, because how do you do that without losing the core, without losing the anchor, and without it, flying off into a chaotic tangent?
What's the negotiation of the essentials? And that's the constant conversation, interdenominationally,
Yeah.
interreligiously. What is the important piece that you hold on to, that this is it? And some groups are like, everything, it's all essential. And at that point you're like, well, I can't have a conversation if it's all essential.
Yeah.
So,
I'm struggling with this right now at my church. We're doing a series on the five solae, from the
mhm,
Protestant Reformation.
mhm,
And it's it's tough for me, because I'm like, this is all just 1600. This is all like Enlightenment philosophy.
Yeah.
Like none of this is real. None of this is gonna. The only reason this has lasted is because we've enforced it, top down for so long. Like when you actually read the scripture, you don't find sola scriptura in the scriptures. How could you? It doesn't make any sense, And like, um, one of the arguments that the pastor made for closed canon was a quote from Deuteronomy. And I'm just sitting there like, so we're going to quote the 5th book of the Bible when making an argument for how nothing else can be added to the Bible. Do we see anything wrong with that analysis? But the flip side of that, if the canon's not closed, what does that mean? We're going to add more books? Like what? Like every century there's new Bible now? Like that doesn't seem like a good idea either. So I understand. I understand where they're coming from. But some of the stuff, it's like, we'll see what stands the test of time,
Well, and I think the difficult part with the solas too is just that it's the interpretations are wildly different. And there's some interpretations I get to and I'm like, yes, I agree with that. And I think every Christian would agree with that. But then there's some that I'm like, no one should believe this interpretation of what this means, because it can't be true. And oftentimes it's the ones I run into that are like what I would call a straw man from another side. Sometimes that's actually what people are saying. And so I'm like, okay, well now you're articulating the worst form of this argument. You need to spend more time developing this idea or this understanding of this concept, I guess.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff, I try to stay humble and remember the fact that I don't know anywhere close to everything, and like certain interpretations, it's like, okay, this has lasted for this amount of time. Maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe I need to just like respect the authority that, pastors and elders have and kind of just like go with what they're saying. But there's like a difference between some things where it's like, I don't think something is true versus like what you're saying can't be true. Like it's not even like logically or internally consistent, and that's the stuff that I have a really hard time with, because it's like the only way I can be humble about this is to just like assume that I have no reasoning capabilities whatsoever. But lots of people believe it. So what does that mean about their reasoning capabilities? Again, it's like, okay, maybe I am missing something here, but yeah, some of the doctrine, especially the stuff we've come up with in the last couple 100 years, I'm just like, I can't wait for this trend to be over. And,
Yeah, I mean, and I think part of that's the essentials, right? Because if some doctrines are deemed essential, then I feel like I have to have a high level of confidence to be able to put my vote behind it, or to say like, okay, I'm part of this. But if it's non-essential, I feel like I can just kind of like, okay, that's fair, and I'm willing to accept my humility and step back and say, I trust this, and I'll do work, and I'll still think about it, but I'm not going to hold it to a higher level of scrutiny. Yeah. But as soon as you put something up on that pedestal, it's like, okay, well now I feel like I have to, the level of certainty has to go up with it. And that's just been a challenge, especially talking to like my Catholic friends of like about some of these things, where I'm like, if this was a non-essential thing for you, I'm fine with that. Like, that's cool.
Right.
But as soon as you say like, this is what you have to believe, I'm like now we have a conversation, I guess, but this is a thing we have to talk about.
Yeah, this has been a big area of growth for me, because what I've realized, and I had to realize this in order to even be part of a church, that there's never going to be anywhere close to the level of like doctrinal alignment from where I'm at to where most people are going to be at. So it's like, what is the most important thing here? Is it that we have the same doctrine, or is it that we have is it the relationships, right? Is it the way that we affect each other's lives, and the way that we speak to each other, and the way that we like do life together. So,
Yeah.
as like a very nerdy, thinky, talky person, it's been a big, um, it's been a big challenge, but a good challenge for me to just like let a lot of that stuff go, and just try to see the person and love the person, and like just set up the chairs and tear them down at the end, and just like that stuff ultimately is a lot more meaningful and fulfilling than like as much as I want to like convince people of my interpretations of certain things, or like as much as I see kind of like this certain idea is keeping people away from our faith and it's preventing us from like inviting people into the church, like as much as I still have those problems, at the end of the day, like if we can form relationships with each other that
Mhm.
reflect the love of Christ, then people will still be drawn to the church, even if the doctrine is wacky. So,
Yeah.
um, I'm trying to prioritize that, but yeah, man, some of these things are hard to let go of, like some of these, some of the, especially the post 1600s stuff I'm like, there, so many more people would be willing to try Christianity if you guys just let that one go, like, but
Yeah. And how do I want to say this? I'm gonna lose it. Oh no. Dang. I think this is what I was trying to get at. The way that AA frames the God of your own understanding, this idea that you have to start somewhere. You have to be able to, like, before you can even expect to fully believe in any of these religious doctrines, no matter what religion that you join or are part of, you have to be able to admit that you're not going to be perfect and you're not going to know everything on the first try. And so you have
yeah,
to at least start somewhere. And so it's like, okay, well, pray to the God that you can understand to the best of your knowledge right now, and trust that, you know, that God will show himself to you, and it's going to be a developmental process. And I think that's the correct way to understand it, or the best way I've seen to be able to um, confessionality kind of stuff is helpful to a certain part, maintaining it's that immune system, but you also need the on ramp of like, well, how do people even expect to get to that point? Like,
yeah,
you don't start believing anything. You have to, take the time to actually develop. You have to, um, trust in God, and have that relationship, and the back and forth, and thinking about things. And again, like you were saying, being in a community and actually experiencing that. Um, so the barrier to entry can't be the goal of the actual entry, because then you defeated the purpose of the organization. Now it's an organization
right.
to hold itself in, and not an organization that has an open door. And it's yeah, it's something that I've been processing a good bit.
Yeah, and I mean this is why, this is why I have so much admiration for Peterson and Pajot, because that was, um, if I was just, I tried that, I went through a pretty intense deconstruction in my college years, and I've tried over the years to go back to church because I grew up in the church and it was super meaningful to me, and then I stopped believing in my early 20s, but I missed that. I missed the community. I missed the meaning from it. And so I would try to go back to church, but I would always hear something from the pulpit that sounded silly to me. There was always some
Hmm.
doctrine that wouldn't make sense. There was always some red herring that the church seemed to be chasing after that wasn't important to me, or even just like, the historicity of the Bible and the way it was put together. Like these were all major problems for me when I went through my deconstruction. And when I came back to church, it wasn't because I encountered some skilled apologetics person who, um, debated me into believing the historicity of the gospel. I came back to church still thinking that, these stories were myths and that, the Bible was just put together by a bunch of dudes in Rome and that like it was political. And, I still had all these problems when I came back to church. And it's not like, the pastor or anyone at the church resolved those issues for me intellectually. What happened was, I saw Peterson reading Genesis from a secular perspective, and I saw him getting so much value out of it. And so I was like, oh, I can get some value out of this too. And then that led me to Peugeot, who was kind of like able to do that, but be more explicitly Christian, whereas Peterson's kind of out on the fringes still. Like, Peugeot is a confessional Christian and like does believe. And so like seeing that he was able to think in this way and also holds the confessional position on Christianity, that was kind of something that was like, oh, okay, like maybe this is possible. And just seeing that example and then just going to church in spite of my problems, right? Like in spite of my disagreements, just going there, trying to encounter God as I understand him, which is the AA thing. Whatever my vague concept of God was at the time, which was mostly informed by like mushroom trips at that point, like it was not not like Christian doctrine that had that built for me at that point in my life. But whatever concept I had, I went to church trying to encounter that thing. And then, yeah, it was encountering people in the church that loved me and cared about me in spite of those disagreements that I think ultimately led to me being willing to be open to these ideas and to think like, oh, maybe there is some deeper truth here that's not just metaphorical. And yeah, it was all relational in the end. It was all me being willing to set aside the brain stuff and just try to be in a relationship with God and try to be in a relationship with the other people in the church. That really transformed my heart and my whole life in the wake of that. So yeah, I really try to hold on to that understanding when it comes to all the theology, doctrinal logic, apologetics, debating stuff. I think the stuff is necessary because we have to try to clear some barriers for people like me who went through that deconstruction. We got to try to get some of that debris out of the way. But ultimately it is the relationship that brings people back.
Yeah. And it's I don't know, part of what this last little bit of my life has been a recognition of the importance of not exactly pragmatism, but like the practicality of these things. I came to the realization indirectly, and then more recently in meditation, like realizing it for sure, is that when I was kind of going through my nihilist like moment, that there was a realization that it just doesn't work. Like I can't live like this, and I'm not living like this. Like even though my mind is kind of stuck in that mode, like the practical way I'm actually living my life is not as a nihilist. And so how do I deal with the dissonance of these two pieces? And that's all through having to recognize how I'm living and either recognize that what's working in my life, the way I'm living, maybe I need to align recognize that what's working through my life is real because it's like coming out of me. It's part of the way I'm living. And then also the other way around, like the ways that I'm not living up to what I'm thinking. Well, maybe I need to correct the way I'm living to those things too. And so practice being an essential piece of all this. Like you were saying with like loving others and these relationships.
Yeah. And identity too, it was really my philosophy around identity that had a huge role in allowing me to come back to Christ, because you know, people say that they're atheists or say that they're nihilists, but you know, like you said, and you know, Peterson has pointed this out too, like very few people actually live like that. I would say there was a point in my life where I really did. I'm such a I'm such like a left brain person that, like, you know, I did, to the most the furthest degree that I could, I did try to live out the idea that, you know, we're all just particles bouncing around in an accidental universe. And so that meant I didn't have to treat other people like they had a divine spark. I didn't have to treat other people like they mattered. I could do whatever I was able to get away with. And I mean, it brings me a lot of pain now, looking back at how I acted during those years. But while I was in it, I was pretty successful at embodying the nihilist worldview and actually living it out. I was pretty successful at not caring how my actions affected other people, because if I did start to feel guilt about something, then I would just tell myself, like, that guilt is a socially constructed force that society is trying to, that's a power play, right? That other beings are trying to put on you. There's no transcendent reason to respect that guilt. And so I would practice overcoming my feelings of sincerity towards other people, you know, like it was like this reverse Christianity, right? Instead of practicing kindness, I practiced selfishness, and I got really good at selfishness. And, you know, I see people now like talking about being a nihilist or talking about being an atheist, and then I see the way they live, and it's like, you have so many Christian values that you're embodied. Like you have like, you know, what's the worst thing you've ever really done? Like, and
It's the whole sheeple thing.
yeah. And man, I did some things that you know, I the way I treated people during that time period, it's like, I'll never be able to atone for some of those things, you know, which is why I'm so thankful that the story of Christ is centrally one about forgiveness, because that was, man, like there's no amount of work that I can do in this life to make up for some of those things, you know. And so but yeah, like if you really practice and live that out, like you'll see where it leads. And I'm glad that you were able to see that ahead of time, and see like, oh, this isn't workable. Because I had to get to a point where it was like my life was so void of meaning and of void of genuine relationship, and everything was so about me, that I could feel myself just like dying. And that was an interesting thing to discover too, because what I realized is that you can't just create your own identity. You can't create your own way of being. There was something inside of me that wanted deeper relationship with other people, that wanted my life to be about not just me. And that means that I'm receiving that identity from something outside, right? Because if it was up to me, I would just keep, you know, sleeping around and playing video games all the time and doing, like, you know, it would all be about money and women and whatever's making me gratified, right? Like, but when I tried to live that out, I became deeply depressed and suicidal and unfulfilled. And it's like, there's a realness to the realization that on some deeper level, that is not who I am. That's incongruent with who I am, or at least who I'm called to be. And so where's that call coming from? Like, what is that? What am I really? Who am I really? And just being willing to accept a higher identity and to surrender to that. That's like, yeah, that's been like so transformative. You know, I mean, that everything, it's crazy how rapidly everything came into alignment when I started seeing it that way. You know, when I started to just surrender to this, okay, there's some higher purpose out there. I'm part of a larger body than just me in this space. You know, I'm a cell and an organ, right? Like I'm not the organ itself. I'm not I look like this discrete person, but in some true sense, I'm actually a cell and an organ, or I'm an organ in a bigger body. Like that is what I am. And you know, when a cell, I remember watching Michael Levin, the microbiologist, the regenerative biologist, talk about this in one of his podcasts, where he says, like, as soon as a single cell begins to act as if it is its own fully contained identity, that's what cancer is, because now it's the other cells around it are an environment instead of part of its identity, and so it's identity the whole way down, you know, like. And then as soon as I started to participate in that higher identity, it's like, oh yeah, this is now everything's starting to feel right. And all you can do is inherit that. All you can do is inherit your cells don't pick that they're, you know, which organ they're going to go to. They just inherit it. And so it's like, it is what it is. All you can really do is surrender to it at some point, you know?
Well, and that's the whole, I think Dante captures it well with the understanding of pride about this, not seeing where you fit into everything. And pride is the thinking that you're greater than you are. And the humility is the understanding of where you fit into the whole picture.
Yeah. Pride is, Pageau talks about this a lot, like just in terms of evil or you know, Satan as such. Like it's always you're the stopping point, right? Like you don't keep going up past yourself. You gather everything else, and then I'm at the top of the pyramid. That's the source of anything that we would call evil or satanic or anything else. And as soon as you you know, gather that up, but then submit to something higher to yourself, then like suddenly you can find meaning, you can find fulfillment, all these things start to fit, all these things start to work, you start to flourish, the people around you start to flourish, you know, like and it even goes like down too, you know, like there's like health issues that I've had like in my body that manifest less now as I'm participating in this, you know. It's like it's goes in both directions too, which you know is also fascinating.
That's been something that's been on my mind a lot lately. The surrender is I think the key bit of this entire thing about once you're able to accept that you know, you've lost the game, then you can actually win the game. It's the cruel irony of the entire thing. I think we're coming up close to the time where I'm going to be kicked off of recording. Is there anything you wanted to kind of close us off on? Any last words you had before we end the recording?
Yeah, I don't think so. I appreciate the talk, man. I wish I had I wish I was where you are at your age. I feel like you're in a really good spot, and I like what you're doing with the channel, and I really appreciated this conversation. And I see that you're married, right? How long have you been married for?
8 months.
Okay, that's like
not very long.
Good job, man. Yeah,
thank you.
That's all I really want to say. Good job. Keep it up.
Thank you. Well, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. It was great, and I don't know. There's not too many people in this space that actually, well, some play video games, but most of them see it as this negative impact on their life, and they went through video game addiction, and they're like, okay, that's got to be out of here.
Definitely can be. I mean, I know all about that side of it too. Yeah,
but also seeing the beauty in it and seeing some of these other pieces that come out of it, I think, I don't know. I don't want to throw it out entirely. The baby with the bathwater, I guess, is my entire thing of like, but don't throw everything away. Like let's hold on to some bit of it. Yeah.
Well, I think we'll start to see more gamers coming around. I mean, I see this in the conversations I have in my Discord server. Like when it comes to spirituality, I think we have the downside of being very left brain nerdy, you know, like doctrinal, whatever logic. But I think through things like
Peterson's work, and just through like good storytelling and gaming too. I think people are starting to wake up. We're starting to see these themes pierce through in modern games, and so I think there will be more dorks like us coming around the corner soon enough.
I sure hope so. Well, I'll shut off the recording, but thank you everyone for watching and for doing this, and I'd love to have this conversation again. Maybe not this conversation, another conversation again. So
yeah, absolutely, man.
I'll shut this off, and then I'll see you on the other side.